All right, Christian Deger, so nice to see you again and talk to you again. So I was last in Munich, I think the end of November 2019, and of course we all know what happened a few months later. So haven't been able to visit in person, but nice to have you in the podcast. So what's been going on in your world of architecture lately?
Also, good to see you again and talk to you, Juan, and thank you for the invitation. So, what's going on in our architecture world? The things we are currently working on that we are improving our maturity of the platform with regards to availability and disaster recovery. So, this is a rather technical topic. And I'm currently in the way to actually, as in my new role as head of platform, to actually define the platform strategy and how the architecture and the platform capabilities are best organized to support the other teams and also solve the problem how to actually grow the platform. So there are platform capabilities in place. And initially, when the platform was younger, a lot of the things that teams required were not available. So there was a lot of push for new requirements from the outside. So the platform was more or less requirement driven. And now we are able to handle the core capabilities required by teams. So now the new challenge is how we change the approach to grow the platform further. And one thing that's important for me is the term minimal viable platform. So I don't want to have a big platform that's growing just because there is a teams working on the platform and they're just adding and adding things to the platform without providing the required value. So the platform should stay lean. And nevertheless, we also want to be in charge of our own destiny, meaning that our new approach, hopefully this plays out for the better, that we are trying to harvest capabilities from other teams, where teams are actually using capabilities that they built for themselves. And then we take those capabilities and make a proper product out of it. That's then a platform offering so that we reduce the cognitive load of the teams by taking those capabilities out and put it into the platform. So we have two flavors there, the tech platform, where we are talking about the infrastructure related part. So as we're on AWS automation and delivery pipelines, monitoring, cost transparency, those kind of capabilities. But also we have a second part, which is called business platform, where we have core capabilities that's required in our business. And there we are looking for capabilities to pull in. And we just started now the first initiatives where we actually are harvesting those things by actually looking at our customers and see what they use and then define a proper architecture and a proper product out of this.
So I think at least in some places the newish term is quality attributes. I guess you're working on the quality attributes. We used to say more like the non-functional requirements, but that's not really the current good term to use, but lots of work to do that, especially kind of designing like a domain of failure. How many different ways can we fail and how do we recover from that and not bring down the whole platform?
Yeah, so limiting the blast radius and also thinking about how each team can individually recover without being dependent on each other. Because if something breaks, the worst thing that could happen is that you then have inter-team dependencies, and you need to first recover that before that can be recovered, and then everything is slowed down. So that's part of the thing. And actually, I never liked the term non-functional requirement. But the term from ThoughtWorks also did not really stick. They used the term cross-functional requirements, which I liked better, but quality attributes also sounds good. I didn't hear that before in that context, but yes, that's actually what we are looking for. And there are multiple quality attributes, and that's also part of the challenge, what quality attributes you need to bring to what level for your current business requirements and for your current maturity, because you always can overdo things. So when you talk about disaster recovery and availability, there are always some people that believe you need to have the availability of Google to be successful, but that's an investment we cannot make. So we need to settle for less. And that's also part of the learning there.
So if we kind of like, if we were writing code in C, we might set jump to 2013 and then long jump back to 2013 when we first met. As I recall, what happened is you were an architect, some lead architect at Autoscout 24 in Munich, and I think you and Philip Gabe,
Yes,
right?
You're very good with names.
And he, so you two invited me to teach, to do some training at Autoscout. And I think I also did a few days, maybe 2 or 3 days of consulting after the workshop. And I met many of your teams there. So it was a very fun time. But interestingly, this was a year when there was a tremendous amount of rain. I think it was all through Europe and maybe not unlike this past month or so. And it was not only rainy, but it was humid. And of course, the offices in Munich have no need of air conditioning, except during that week or month or something, and it was hot.
I can totally remember how you actually suffered through the workshop. And you rightfully so complained about the conditions, but sadly enough, there were nothing we could do about. Yes, in Germany and also in that office building, air conditioning is not that common as it is in the States, and it's typically also not needed. And we just have picked the hottest week of the years before and after that, and were crammed in a rather big crowd in a room. And I believe that the workshop was great, but people also, if the temperature would be lower, would have been more engaged and would have grasped more. This was just worst circumstances to have such a. And by the way, Philip is also joining me in my new endeavor, and he's working as a product owner in the tech platform I just mentioned. So we are still working together. I pulled him over.
That's cool.
But he's no longer in the domain part of things. He since then flipped to the more infrastructure side of things.
Yeah, I recall something about he was doing more DevOps work before. So if we take a little step forward in Autoscout, eventually you became the chief architect, or I don't know how many chief architects they had, maybe one or maybe a few, but you became a chief architect at Autoscout. And this was maybe the result of some good work that you did there. And so after the training, you went on this adventure, I guess, of breaking up the big ball of mud at Autoscout 24, resulting in microservices. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, certainly. So first of all, about the chief architect, there was only one. So to clarify that one. And yes, so in I believe as the workshop was in 2013, after that, so it was in the same year, we at Autoscout had to make a decision around our tech stack. So we were running on Windows in the data center using .NET, and ownership of Autoscout changed and new questions were raised. And I believe the new owners didn't like Windows and .NET particularly, and also didn't like the aspect of having a rather big scale web presence in Windows technology in the data center. So they were more in favor of Linux and a more Linux-based language. So this was the first trigger point where my manager just asked me, Christian, how do you see the future of .NET at Autoscout? And I said, I would rather move away from it. Okay, that's aligned with our top management. So from there on, we started multiple conversations about how we can actually change things there. And in the end, we came up with a packet where we actually wanted to change everything at the same time. Everything that was viable to change, we wanted to put into this project, which meant moving from Windows and .NET to Linux and the JVM using Scala as language. We then also said we don't make this transition in the data center anymore. when we do this, we also move to the cloud. We picked AWS for that. And when we are also moving to AWS, then we should re-architecture our monoliths, which had some problems at that point in time. And microservices were just becoming the new thing. And this was actually when the microservice article from Martin Fowler came out, this was more or less the blueprint of the discussion we at that point in time had already internally. So this is where we believed we should head for. And suddenly the article came out and it was putting a lot of context and names into our thought process. And of course, when changing to the cloud, we also wanted to change our operating model. So we used to be in two silos, the dev silo and then the handover to the operations silo. So they were then responsible for running the VMs and the .NET services in the data center. And we also wanted to change this to go with a you build it, you run it model. And so we packed a lot of changes into that project. But in hindsight, it was a lot of things we did at the same time. So there might have been more simpler approaches to skin the cat, but also all of those changes also depended on each other. So we didn't want to run Windows on AWS. So this was a complexity we didn't want to have there. Every normal workload you could read about on AWS is running on Linux. Why should we be the ones who are running on Windows? And then have an operation team that runs things on AWS also feels wrong. So we stick with the idea. We put everything into this one project and start the transition. So, and during that project, this was also the time when I changed my role from being a team leader before that into the role of an architect. And as then the project grew and encompassed more of Autoscout engineering, then I also stepped up into the role of the chief architect there.
Yeah, that's very good and good results, because I'm sure they didn't ask you to be the chief architect because you failed. You know, I mean, it must have worked out pretty well. I'm sure there were some glitches and a few things along the way, but you pulled through it, right? So how did that go?
So from what I'm hearing, they're still working on the same principled approach when we started that transition. Are you now more interested in how we did the migration or in my role during that migration?
Well, I think now it would be good to just talk about how you did the migration, like what.
So what we did, I believe in beginning of 2014, we started with one team. And this team was comprised of all the people who actually were cheering for this approach. So everybody wanted to go to AWS and wanted to do a new way of continuous delivery, who wanted to do you build it, you run it, and also believed now is a good time to actually learn Scala. I believe we were 8 engineers at that point in time. And this was the first team. And we picked out of the monolith, the one capability which we could provide value if we would change it. And that's also from an architectural perspective, a good blueprint how to actually carve this out of the monoliths, including the data synchronization and all of those things that need to be done between the data center and AWS, and pick this one as the first capability / product to pull out, and then started from scratch. So installing on the new shiny MacBook, because we of course were using Windows laptops before that, running on .NET. We got new shiny MacBooks. We created an AWS account, installed IntelliJ, started fiddling around with Scala, and started with the deployment pipeline on AWS and started the infrastructure automation. So everything required to actually deploy this new service into AWS with a continuous delivery mindset and you build it, you run it concept. We built in the first team from scratch and put the first service into production. And I believe after 3 or 4 months, we just added the second team to the project. So we felt familiar enough that the foundation was laid out so that we could actually pull in a second team, picked the next capability. So at that point in time, we were not finished with the first one, but we were just confident enough that we are on the right track, that we can pull in more capacity. And then we started with the second team. I then also changed to the second team, and I believe half of the people from the first team went to the second team, so that the second team then actually has the experience from the first team. We filled up the gaps in the first team, and then we're running with two teams. And by that time, the infrastructure components that were shared between those two teams, we just distributed between the teams. So some of them were running the delivery pipeline. The other team was doing the infrastructure automation and stuff like that. So we just pulled things into half and continue with that. And sometime later, I believe half a year later, or it could be 3 or 4 months, not certain, we pulled in two further teams. So we just doubled up again and distributed the people to those 4 teams. And at that point in time, we then also learned that now with 4 teams, it did not work anymore, that we could just simply rely that we will stay on the same path and the same mental model. Too many new people came onto the project, and this is where also the architectural transition happened, where we moved to a more principle-based approach, where we set up our architecture principles. This is how we actually want to do things. This is the idea behind our thing, how we approach things, so that the growing number of people could actually stay on the same track and be aligned with the vision behind what we laid out first. And yes, with the growing number of people, of course, the coordination effort increased, the attention in within the company increased, because before that it was just one small experiment. Now it was a bigger initiative. This was at a point in time where also operation became a little bit nervous. What's going to happen there? Before that, they could just say, hey, they're trying something on the cloud. Don't worry, this will fail. They will come back to our beautiful data center. But then they realized, hey, this is not going away. We need to do something.
Like learn Scala. Maybe we should learn Scala.
That was actually not the reaction, but what we did, and this was originally also the plan, that in each of those teams, one from the previous operation team or operation department. So this was actually, as we all talked about, this was a silo there. We pulled in one of those operations guys into the teams and embedded them so that the team has also the operational capacity. Of course, they needed to learn AWS. And we also initially pulled in those who were also in favor of AWS. So for the first round, this was rather easy, because there were a lot of people who wanted to join there. Over time, this, of course, became more difficult, because you have the VMware guru and the Oracle DBA, and they all knew if this train continues, I need to either change my role or need to find a different approach to my future career. But a lot of people took on, and this is also how over time, naturally, we moved from dev and ops to DevOps, because yes, the management commitment was in a way that in the end, the operation part as it used to be before would be gone, and would be more or less be gone together with the data center.
You said a couple of things there that I thought we could branch just a little bit, maybe not too far. But first of all, any comment on, it sounded like you really didn't like strangle the monolith. You sort of just replaced functionality, or were you developing brand new services that didn't exist at all, even on the monolith implementation?
So we did both. So the first thing we pulled out there, this was actually a classical strangler. So the thing we pulled out there existed before in the monolith, and as a result of bringing that service in production, so the definition of done for that one is it's served out of AWS and it's removed from the monolith. The second part, this was also driven by business requirements. Was actually something new, a capability that did not exist before, and then was actually integrated back as UI composition and some other things that was integrated back into the monolith and rather soon. So the timing was not perfect there, but we later translated this also to be integrated with when we pulled out the corresponding capabilities into AWS. But yes, this was a new capability, and I would say 90% of the capabilities we pulled out of the monoliths were following the strangler pattern. So if you look at Autoscout, for those people who don't know what the company is doing, it's like AutoTrader. So my understanding is the same, and you put a listing on the site, and the listing is then there is some magic happens to the listing, but in the end, from a consumer perspective, you can search for the listings, you can bookmark the listings, and you can get notified if new listings matching your search criteria appear on the site. So it's, from a domain perspective, rather a simple thing that happens there. And a big chunk from a scaling perspective and from where the user is interacting is the whole search capability. And that was after the first two we pulled out, which could be seen in the area of harmless. We pulled out the big search capability because this made sense, because there we needed the elasticity. This was helpful because people are searching during the day, they're not searching in the night. So we could properly use the elasticity because there was quite some load in there. And also the data architecture behind that was not that complicated, because all the back office processes on those listings stayed in the data center, and then we had a data pipeline forwarding the to be published listings to AWS using SQS, and later we put in Kafka also, and sitting on top of those ready to be published listings were the search capabilities and the other things I just mentioned. And this, of course, was also a strangler pattern, but not too complicated from an integration perspective. And just only conceptually, the biggest thing we needed to deal with was the tight integration in the Oracle database around all the listing back office processes, because there were Oracle, PSQL triggers. Everybody was munching around on the data, and very few people actually knew the life cycle in the first seconds when listings were entered until it was actually ready to be published, because this was all hidden in database code and some services that worked on that. And that was actually from a decomposition perspective the hardest challenge, to actually pull those things out of each other. And this was not a fault of the microservice architecture, but this was a fault that the thing wasn't modular to begin with. So this was a mess, and we already knew that. And whatever we would need to do to improve the situation would be a re-architecture anyway. So that also made sense to pull that over. But that part was not finished until I left Autoscout.
Interesting, and lots of work, just amazing amount of work involved in that. And a lot of clients that I meet, and they think that somehow something that they built over 20 or 30 years can be broken into microservices in a few weeks or something, and they're really miffed, I guess, or crestfallen when they find out that no, it's really not quite like that. Now, when you said that you removed, or that the functionality or the capability was removed from the monolith. I'm guessing C#, I think was C#. When you say it was removed, do you mean literally you were able to carve the code out of and remove it from the code base in C#, or did you just sort of disconnect the things that reached into that code? Like, for example, the first microservice that you built.
So we actually also removed the corresponding code from the monolith. Yes.
That's quite a feat in itself, I think, because sometimes you just have to leave things running in the monolith because so many other things are dependent on it that you have to build up quite a body of microservices before you can actually point all the user interface or much of the user interface for some capability or a few into the microservices. It's an interesting challenge.
And as you already mentioned, a challenge that you typically underestimate. Because if you just look at the capability on a whiteboard and reason about who is actually calling whom from the best of your knowledge, and then you estimate the entanglement and how long it takes to pull things out, there is always one more caller that's calling into something which nobody is aware of, that this was built 5 years ago. And when you then actually believe, now I can remove the capability from the monolith, yes, there's still somebody using it, and then you have to go there also, and but I believe there is no way around it. So it's not funny, and as I already mentioned, most of the problems come from the big ball of mud. It's not the problem of being in a monolithic code base. It's just everybody calls everything as he saw fit, either in code or via APIs, and you just create a mess, and at some point in time you need to clean things up.
And you mentioned another thing too that caught my ear, with the way that teams were formed and grew within the new architecture, the microservices architecture. And you talked about seeding, like you start out with one team and then you seed the next team with experience. And I often get the question, how do we scale domain-driven design? And first of all, well, maybe that's not necessarily the best idea. You can always use strategic design for all microservices, but maybe not all microservices deserve the tactical modeling prowess that's needed for a core domain or something like that. But the fact that you have to have experience on teams to grow, and even if you bring in, a few very experienced DDD consultants, to help you, they can still only really work with a few teams themselves and, help them gain ground. So it's really best to have those people working with experience and then themselves carrying on. And this is Conway's Law, right? Every interview that I have, it always just boils back down to Conway's Law, that people and conversation, communication, collaboration is what goes into architecture. What do you think about that?
Yeah, so first of all, so not every service, or rather few of the services, were built with the tactical DDD patterns. So the domain, in many cases, did not warrant going for the tactical patterns. And yes, Conway's Law and how to actually scale the organization and get people not only up to speed, but get them aligned behind the original idea. So if you just ramp up the number of people too fast, they don't know what to do. And as a chief architect, as one person, you cannot act fast enough to fix all the things that will go haywire then if people just make up their mind. So those principles and the core learnings, how things are wired up and why they are wired up like this, and what's the core idea and the principle behind it is important. And this is also one of the things where we actually, after some times in the project, we came to the conclusion that we would not do part of the scaling process again. So initially we had this, as you described, this the seeding process, and going from one team to two teams worked quite well, because you have four people who know everything and four new people, and they can teach the others. And this is you don't need to be explicit about it. That this just happens. But at some point in time, the amount of new people,
The knowledge gets
yes,
diluted, I guess.
and I would pick a different model, more of a boot camp model. So new people get into a team that knows how things are done, and you have a team of let's say 7 or 8 people. You inject 2 new peoples in there, and they get assimilated in a positive sense. They know how things are working, and then you can shrink down the team again, and we have perhaps 2 or 3 of those teams where you have seeded those new people in, and then you carve out a new team out of the grown bigger teams, and then you start injecting new people into those teams again, so that they go through a proper learning, and that the ratio of people who know the topics to the ratio of people who are new to the topics is not overwhelming for the people, because then also that team cannot produce anything meaningful if they're constant in a constant learning mode. So, but of course, this slows the potential speed of ramping up down, because you need deliberately put people in there and give them the time to actually learn. But I believe we are talking about people, and this is in contrast to scaling on AWS, not something that happens automatically. You need to take your time for this.
I don't know how much you use Scala across all the microservices, but just to give a little of my experience around Scala is when I started using Scala, I did view it as a better Java, but I viewed it as a much better Java, not just like a marginally better Java. But it's said that there are 2 kinds of Scala developers. There's the Scala developer who's really happy that they'll never have to use Java again. And then there's the Scala developer who's bitter because they aren't coding in Haskell, right? And the thing is I was very much the first one, but then I ran into too many of the second ones, the second kind, and it just became, to my mind, very toxic. How did you prevent or maybe you didn't, maybe it worked out there where you just said, okay, let's go so functional, so to speak, that any new hire we have who even knows Scala well will not be able to read this code. Do you know what I mean?
So of course the Scala decision was also the most controversial. So we could also have picked Java. This would be more familiar for a C# developer to go from C# to Java. But at that point in time, we believe people who have picked C# over Java in their career made this as a conscious decision. So forcing them back, in quotes, to Java was not a good idea. And C# at that point in time gained some functional capabilities, so it moved in that direction. Some people were actually looking at F# at that point in time. So Scala was in the end what we settled on, and then most of our people needed to learn Scala from scratch. So we had internal Scala learning groups, we had external support to actually learn Scala, and there we already took care, as we already knew, that Scala has a problem. There's no idiomatic Scala. Everybody does it slightly different, and we put an emphasis from the beginning that we stay on a same middle ground, and try to bring people into that direction. But as soon as we also pulled in some consultants from service provider, and people became more familiar with Scala. Of course, all of those Haskell ideas also came up, and then we had I believe it was Scala Guild at that point in time, which then more or less tried to align the usage of Scala within Autoscout, so that that we are not having too much difference between the teams on this language. As we this was stated in multiple blog posts from companies moving to Scala, because this was a known issue that you can go bananas with Scala.
Yeah, and when you have to ship software and you have very real deadlines with very real billionaires waiting for this stuff to like be delivered, and you have a few people sit you down and say, well, let me explain Kleisli arrows, or what, or and you're just like, yeah, but that's all interesting, but we just really have to ship code, and I think you'd agree that my code is actually not wrong, but if you want it to be wrong, you'll get me to use the Cat's library or whatever, Scala Z, or anyway, nothing against those and nothing against the people who can work together and actually ship software that way. But it is a real challenge to prevent those sort of, the mayhem of two, more interested in extreme functional than shipping software. And yeah, so I'd never talked to you about that, but I'm not at all surprised that you hit that wall, so to speak.
Yeah, and actually, this was the language. This, as I already mentioned, it was controversial, but in the end, it also had a positive effect on our hiring efforts, because we were then a go-to shop for people who wanted to deliberately make the transition from O to more functional languages. And they now not only could do this in their spare time, but they now would get paid to do it in Scala. In my new job, they used to do Java, and I tried a different approach and do a more less aggressive change. We just moved to Kotlin, which has fewer of the problems of Scala, but has also not the uptake in potential that Scala has. So this is from a culture, and who are you actually able to hire? There are subtle differences. If you make such a language decision, you get different people. And I just got the news from somebody who I worked with at Autoscout, who also moved to the new company and is now moving back to Autoscout because he wants to do Scala again. So that's he just can't live with Kotlin. So there you go. And of course, it has an effect. You get slightly more engaged and perhaps potentially a little bit more brilliant people with those languages, and then you need to take care that they don't go into mayhem mode. So yeah.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, more Conway's Law. So okay, let's shift gears here a little bit. So in 2014, so maybe during or this whole break up the monolith into microservices, you started the Munich Microservices meetup, and I ended up speaking at that. I don't know. I think I've spoken there 3 or 4 times, and I think the last time you got a chuckle out of that. I actually contacted you and said, "Hey Christian, can I speak again at the meetup?" And well, I was shamelessly promoting Ilingo Zoom platform. So anyway, but tell us a little history about the meetup.
Yeah. So as I already mentioned, when Martin Fowler's blog post about microservices came out, we saw that now what we are discussing on the whiteboard has finally has a name. And of course, still after the blog post, a lot of discussion ramped up in the news circles, and of course, not every question we wanted to have answered was answered in the blog post, because it was also on a high level still. But we betted our company on doing microservices, so we just said let's build a self-helping group. We just do a meetup, and hopefully other peoples will come, and we can discuss our approach to microservices. And it started small. So the first group, I believe this were 9 people. Then we ramped up to 13 people. And it was a brand new topic, and people were engaged. And then somehow it grew, and almost everybody who at some point in time wrote a book, a blog post, or mentioned microservices in the first 2 years showed up at the meetup at some point in time. So this was quite a great experience. And this is how the speaker community works. So they just love to talk. Of course, everybody has something to promote. That's either it's employer, his new book, or whatever. But in essence, those speakers give so much to the community, and then sit there in the evening with a beer and pizza, and having those high level conference speakers speak at your meetup. This was a really nice thing. And I believe we are now at 61 meetups. Of course, it came to a screeching halt during the pandemic. I don't. I joined some online conferences and meetups, and yes, this is a viable alternative, but not something that I'm interested in organizing. So I need beer and pizza and talking to people. So this is the fun in there for me. Of course, you learn something, but it's the talk is just to start the conversation that's happening afterwards. You learn something, and you discuss it, and then you learn even more. So hopefully we can ramp this up soon, that people can confidently meet again in closed areas. And yeah, so that's and of course, we learned so much in with those 61 meetups. This is just we were able to shine a light on all aspects around microservices. So yes, so this was happened as a small thing and became something rather big. And I'm glad that people like you find the meetup that inspiring, that you show up by yourself. This was really a nice thing that happened there. Thank you.
Thank you. And I really have to say that the original space that you were in, sort of like a tunnel, was where a beer was stored at one time. Which, what does Munich have to do with beer? You know? But that was a very interesting place. Now, of course, you hold it in your new employment offices, yeah. And that, I mean, they're very nice, and probably even a bit more room, I think, in the new place. But that old space was very, what do you say, romantic or something?
Yeah, actually, so if I look at pictures from meetups in the original area, if I'm rebooting the microservice meetup, I'm strongly considering to go back to the original area. So it has two advantages. It had a really good charisma and feeling to it, and it was more central than our current location. And this would be then more a courtesy to the audience to go to such a nice venue, and not pull them into your office building. Of course, the employer pays for the meetup, so therefore a little bit of promotion is also due there. But having the nice location is something I would also strongly look forward to be there again.
Yeah, and I think it's a good thing for other meetup groups, meetups to consider is, the venue is really important. If you can do something about the venue, it's worth it. And so let me just, we're kind of running on time here, but sort of running out of time, but hey, we can continue if we like, and people can put it on triple speed or something. but so okay, you have this meetup on microservices. Did you ever discuss monoliths at all? And if so, how did you go about doing that?
So we actually had to look it up again. The name, we had one particular meetup that stood out for me there. It was called Majestic Modular Monoliths. It was held by Axel Fontaine, and he was actually a strong advocate, and it was a really good meetup. And it reflects also my thought process, and we discussed similar things when I talked about the Autoscout situation. Modularizing the monoliths is just in itself something that's viable to do, and microservices, if you do it too soon or you do it for the wrong reason, as with all of those architectural decisions, is not the right answer per se. You need to be aware what's your context, what are your alternatives, and staying with the monoliths if has a lot of advantages. Axel was advocating this quite strongly, and we also had a second meetup where actually the journey from this was a startup, and they actually went through the proper thought process, I believe, and they said, we know that we will end up with a microservice architecture, and the people working in that startup were actually working before that at a company where they were doing microservices, and they were also speaking about those microservices already at the microservice meetup. And then some people did a new startup and then talked about how they started with the monolith. So this was, and they did it for the right reasons, because they said, okay, we are exploring the domain. We actually don't know how to carve things up. This is we need this part to be soft. We need to be able to change this. We are learning. This is not a domain where everything is laid out and you can just pull out the DDD sample book and it's written down there how the context should be carved up. We need to learn this. And we also don't want to have all the additional complexity in the infrastructure deployment, having a message bus or something in there. We just leave that for later if we tackle the first problem. But of course, they in the beginning also thought about proper modularizing the first thing, because they knew they will split it up into microservices. And when they were certain enough that they knew about their context and how things were measuring up, and they needed the ability to scale and work at individual parts separately and use the advantages of microservices, they then started splitting up the thing. And I believe this is how you should do it. And this was quite a good meetup as they presented this.
Yeah, and thank you, by the way, for being willing to read our strategic monoliths and microservices book. That I thought of you immediately with having you read at least a late copy. I know you're too busy to be a formal reviewer, but thank you for taking time to read that. And so really, you reflect a lot of experience in those areas. So if you were to describe, even in your current work, the enterprise architecture that you're working on in a platform, how do bounded contexts of domain-driven design help you there? Or how do you use them even?
Okay. So first of all, the most important part, because when I joined the company, they didn't thought about that. So they built microservices and just used nouns or whatever to actually carve up their services. And then, yeah, there were, of course, the deployable artifacts and all of those things didn't match up with how we then, after introspecting it, would see the context map. So that was the first part, to actually reverse engineer how the domain and the context actually look like. We built context maps for that to get that insight how things are playing, and there were also then some changes needed to make the things more sane and put things into the right places. What I really emphasized at that point in time, and this is also part of the problem with the term microservice. There are a lot of potential definitions, and I don't want to be in the argument to re-explain what microservice flavor we are actually doing. This is too cumbersome. So for that intent and purpose, we switched to the bounded context as a granularity we typically talk about. And this means that we also have a multi-account strategy on AWS. So every bounded context was moved into its separate AWS account. So what I found there was they had a microservice architecture, but a monolithic infrastructure with a microservice runtime in the center, which is also no fun at all. So there we carved out the microservices and grouped them together into those AWS accounts and centered all our infrastructure. So how we skin our repositories into projects, how the pipelines function, and how the teams are organized. Everything was centered around the bounded context, especially on an AWS level. So, and there was one of the principles we came up with is that the bounded context cannot use any AWS lower level to communicate with each other. So no network or queues or anything like that between them directly, but they all need to have proper interfaces. So the APIs for those bits and pieces where we actually do REST or HTTP APIs, and then the underlying Kafka where events and data change and IoT streams are exchanged between those microservices. So that in the end, the account boundary was a reinforcement of the context boundary with the respective interfaces being clearly defined. You can only interact with this bounded context via this API or via Kafka messages. Everything else is forbidden. And this helped quite a lot. So it steered away from the microservices discussion and put the bounded context in the center of all of those discussions.
Again, a lot of thought, a lot of discipline, actually, right? And getting people to work together to agree on standards, and instead of, everybody does their own thing, and few people can pick up from where they left off. So I think it's a good investment for you. I guess one last thing that I wanted to explore today, it sounds like we need to actually have another podcast sometime. But being a chief architect, being the head of architecture and enterprise platform and so forth, these are kind of, I would say, roles that a lot of software developers or new architects or senior architects would like to find themselves in. How does that work, Christian? How, like, if you were to explain what does a chief architect actually do, and I just have to say one thing. From what I take from Autoscout, you were a very hands-on chief architect, whereas a lot of chief architects that I meet are very much like, talking to CTOs and CIOs most of the time, trying to influence them to do things rather than, hands-on software. So anyway, tell us about those roles, and if someone was kind of wanted to aspire to those, what would you suggest?
Okay, so I cannot comment on the general role of the chief architect. I've only experience with myself as chief architect, but I can try to describe what my idea behind this role is and how I'm living it. So first of all, yes, the hands-on part got pushed away. The added responsibilities, leading teams, being responsible for the tech platform, business platform, and for the architecture. Sadly, removed me a little bit from hands-on coding. I'm still involved in all of those technology and architecture discussions, but the hands-on part, actually, I cannot do currently. Nevertheless, on hobby projects or once in a while, I'm reading code, so that still stays, and I'm navigating through repositories if I want to find out something without asking people, because the truth lies in the code and not in the answer. So, but with that out of the way, the for me the role of the chief architect is to give the vision, the translate the business requirements into architecture and strategy, but yeah, mostly about the vision and enabling a culture where people can see the structure in there and actually can follow through. So guidelines, principles, those kind of things. So for example, we have, so yeah, let's start with the one as well. I believe I've copied that one from Stefan Tilkov, that I see three kinds of architecture. So in the simplest way, there's the domain architecture. We already talked about that one. Then there is the macro architecture, which is on what platform am I running, how the interface is described. So everything, how in our world those bounded contexts connect and what are the standards and guardrails, security, those kind of things. And then there is the micro architecture. This is more or less what happens within one of those AWS accounts or within one of those microservices. And the chief architect's responsibility is to, in my opinion, is to be in charge of fostering the domain-driven part, so that the context map is present and used by all teams when they are doing those discussions, and it's constantly evolved. And they use the strategic patterns of DDD. Then together with the teams, define the macro architecture. So what are those guardrails? What do we believe in? What kind of interfaces do we use at that force? And then on the micro architecture, give the teams guidance, but also the freedom and the autonomy to make a lot of decisions there on their own. So what we are doing is we are regularly building a tech radar together with the lead engineers and input from the teams, which we then also derive the tech stack from. So what's in adopt in our tech radar? This is our current tech stack we use, so that the teams have guidance, what we already learned, what we like, what we put on hold, but still have the responsibility, but also the freedom to make a lot of decisions to pick and choose. So we are not setting forth, you need to use MySQL or you need to use Postgres or DynamoDB. You can use whatever. There are people you can talk to if you're not certain about your decision, but the team knows their use case best to make those kind of decisions. So that's not on a macro architecture level. So that's what I'm working on. And then of course the principles. So we have taken our time to address the things which are important for us, so that everybody is aligned behind those. For example, we have a principle, the same we also had at Autoscout, AWS first. So we want to be cloud native. And if we want to use infrastructure, we use the infrastructure from AWS with all the caveats that come with that. Of course, we have a login and those things, but we try to stay with those services that's provided by AWS. With also with the added part, we pick the services as much in the high level area as possible. So the higher up, the better. We are not using EC2 anymore. We're using Fargate for containers, and always moving up level, looking, of course, also using serverless. On the flip side, we don't roll out something like Kubernetes or things which Of course, you can run Kubernetes on AWS, and there is also a managed service for this, but it's not required to do that, and that there is a higher level abstraction available on AWS. And this is one of our principles, and every engineer knows this. So this is, and we have only a few of them, so that in the day-to-day work, people know how RIO ticks and what kind of architecture and how we progress things without needing to handhold them all day. Setting up the frame, setting up the vision, and then watch beautiful things happen.
That sounds good. Yeah, beautiful things happen. I have to say, I hate to stop talking right now, but I think we probably should. But this just gives us another reason to have another conversation for people to hear more later. And let's encourage everybody to make beautiful things happen. And part of that means knowing what you want to do, right? And what you need to do. Understand that well and stick with it. Christian, thank you so much for joining us for the podcast. It's always a pleasure to speak with you, and hopefully we can meet up again in person someday soonish. Hopefully we'll see. And I look forward to talking with you again.
Thank you very much for having me. It was a pleasure talking to you again. And yes, that this would be either follow-up, but I would love to have a follow-up in person and in perhaps on each side of the world. Perhaps we can meet again in Munich, have one of those Bavarian beers and some Schweinshaxe or something like that, and have a good time. Just after all this pandemic trouble, this would be a nice thing to look forward to. And I really I feel honored that you picked me for the podcast, and hopefully some of the things I babbled along are interesting to people. So thank you again for having me.
They're going to be very interesting, and I can assure you that. And it was also an honor for me. So we'll see you next time.
See you.